Continuing in my series about famous universalists who have shaped our tradition, in 1863, Olympia Brown became the first woman minister whose ordination was confirmed by a national denomination. It's probably what she is most remembered for. It was a defining moment in her life, but it wasn't the only thing she did. She was born in Michigan in 1835. She was the oldest of 4 children. Her parents insisted on her getting an education. She did her first year of college at Mount Holyoke and didn't like the religious atmosphere there, and she went to Antioch College, a liberal institution founded by Horace Mann, who was a Unitarian education reformer and uniquely said that there would be no doctrine taught at this college, which is the amazing thing about us as liberals. We have this great thing, but whenever we set something up, we say, but we won't have religion there. And we ignore telling about our own religion. But while at college, she marveled at the distinguished speakers that Mann attracted to the college, including Horace Greeley and Edward Everett Hale. And despite its coeducational philosophy, Antioch never invited female lecturers. So, believing no woman at all comparable to the men invited. Students customarily arranged these visiting lectures, so Olympia organized other women students, raised a lecturer fee, and brought Antoinette Brown Blackwell, who was a lay minister and reformer, to preach at the village Christian church. This was the essence of Olympia Brown. When she saw wrongs, she simply righted them. She wrote, "It was the first time I heard a woman preach, and the sense of victory lifted me up. I felt as though the kingdom of heaven were at hand." So she decided after graduation to attend seminary. Most seminaries flatly refused to allow women to be students. St. Lawrence merely strongly discouraged her, so she went there, surprising the president when she showed up. And he wrote, "I do not think women are called to be ministers, but I leave that between you and the great head of the church." And she found that once she showed up there, she was treated fairly well by the professors. She found that some of the professors' wives wondered what she was doing there, and some of her male students often teased her for the high-pitchedness of her voice. She was a small woman, weighed about 90 pounds, but she was strong. And she went through her classes pretty much without any formal opposition until at the end she said, "Well, now I need to be ordained." And that got some more opposition, but she just held her ground until she was. And she served her first parish in Weymouth Landing, Massachusetts, and after 5 years had moved on to Bridgeport, Connecticut. She married John Henry Willis in 1872 and took a leave of absence from the parish in 1874 after giving birth to her first child. And while she was on leave, there was people in the churches that kept on inviting male ministers in and saying, what this church really needs is a male minister. So by the time that she was ready to come off of leave, her job really wasn't there. And so in 1876, she moved to Racine, Wisconsin. And her husband closed up his business in Connecticut and started a new one in Racine. And she was minister there until 1885. Of her career as a parish minister, she writes, "Those who may read this will think it strange that I could only find a field in run-down or comatose churches. But they must remember that the pulpits of all the prosperous churches were already occupied by men and were looked forward to as the goal of all the young men coming into the ministry, with whom I, at first the only woman preacher in the denomination, had to compete. All I could do was take some place that had been abandoned by others and make something of it. And this I was only too glad to do. I did my ministerial internship at Olympia Brown UU Church in Racine. In her day, it was called Church of the Good Shepherd, and instead of a cross on their steeple, they had a shepherd's crook across the spire. And the name referred to the parable of Jesus, in which Jesus says, "What do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep, and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go look for the one that wandered off? And if he finds it, I tell you the truth, he is happier about that one sheep than the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing to let any of these little ones be lost." And this was often cited by Universalists as a proof text for universal salvation, that there was no hell. And the theme is repeated in John, who reports that Jesus said, "I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep, so when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd." The Good Shepherd is a metaphor for extreme dedication in saving all. And Olympia Brown felt that dedication and was motivated by her religion to expanding the rights for all. When she was in seminary, the Civil War was raging, and it was a liberal seminary, and so that there were a lot of students speaking about giving the Negro the vote. And she said, "Does that include the Negro woman?" She wasn't well received. In 1885, Wisconsin passed a half-hearted suffrage law that provided in part that every woman over 21 had the right to vote in any election pertaining to school matters. Since women deal with children, it would be school matters. Olympia reasoned that, in a sense, all elections are related to school matters. And this interpretation thrust her into the national spotlight in one of Wisconsin's most celebrated court cases. In the spring 1887 election, she and about 20 other women showed up at the polls intending to vote for officers no way connected with educational matters. Their votes refused. Olympia filed suit against the election inspectors and won. This landmark decision essentially enfranchised Wisconsin's women, but the state Supreme Court overturned the ruling just 2 months later. And she refused to share her colleagues' bitterness about this defeat, and she turned her energy to doing suffrage work full time. This is when she resigned from the pulpit, but still remained in Racine, Wisconsin. And at that time, most of the suffrage movements were state by state, and she felt that they really needed to push for a national suffrage movement. Her husband died in 1893, and at that time owned part of the newspaper. She bought out the remaining partners and managed the local newspaper for 7 years. In 1914, she retired, moved to Baltimore to live with her daughter. And 6 years later, the 19th Amendment finally passed, and Olympia Brown, at 85, one of the last survivors of the suffragist leadership, cast her first vote. She was a woman to be reckoned with. Supposedly retired, living with her daughter in Baltimore, she made the trip to Washington, D.C. to march in front of the White House. These type of demonstrations were not common in those days, and definitely not ladylike. In fact, other women's suffragette movements distanced themselves from these radicals that were standing in front of the White House for months on end. She said she was told that since it was during World War I, that women should put aside the suffrage while we were fighting the war. She replied, "Women were asked to do the same thing during the Civil War." She had experience on her side, and she wasn't going to be put off anymore. President Wilson was traveling in France, and she burned a copy of the speech that he was going to be giving when he went to Europe. And she said, "America has fought for France and the common cause of liberty. I have fought for liberty for 70 years, and I protest against the president leaving our country with this old fight unwon." "It's highly improper for ladies to march in protest," several said to her. "Ladies should not be on the streets marching and carrying signs." And she replied, "Ladies will never get the vote if they don't demand it. Women have been dignified for over 60 years, and we still do not have the vote. Is it because we are too dignified to fight for the ballot? Is being proper more important than being able to vote?" Shortly after she voted, she gave her last sermon at her former congregation in Racine in 1920. And she said, "When the other day I saw women of all conditions coming into the polling booth, all filled with great enthusiasm, forgetting old prejudices, old associations, and give themselves to new subjects to study, not to serve any particular party, but only to learn how to help the world, I said, they are grander than I thought. There is a divine life in them, which this new experience is revealing." She saw the vote as a spiritual transforming experience. Evidence of divine. And she believed that the divine was working still and that revelation was not sealed in the Bible. In the same sermon, she wrote, "We relied on the promises of revelation, and we still cherish these grand old texts, and they will ever remain in our memories as precious possessions," referring to the Bible. "But now they are fortified and confirmed by the promises that come to us from nature. Today, we are not dependent on any book or a letter from any book. Science has been unraveling the mysteries of the universe and brought new lights, new example of divine power and purpose." Her embrace of science as a holy endeavor was a precursor to modern understandings of the truth. Unlike the religious rite of today, she did not fear science. She saw science as opening doors. The opening doors lead to no dark dungeons, open upon no burning lake, give no evidence of everlasting punishment, but all gladden us with the assurance of divine goodness and indicate the final triumph of good. Rather than seeing an angry, punishing God, Brown saw God as a force for good in the world, a benevolent Father that unites us all as children. She continues, we talk of reforms. We have hoped to make the world safe for democracy, to establish a league of peace. But the very first necessity in reform work is the recognition of the divine capabilities in man. The foundation of democracy is the realization that every human being is a child of God, entitled to the opportunities of life, worthy of respect, and requiring an atmosphere of justice and liberty for his development. And what we had read earlier today, we can never make the world safe for democracy by fighting. Rather than the sharing of power, of justice done to each humble individual, shall we be able to create a firm basis for the state. We can only establish a league of peace by teaching the nations the great lesson of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. Every nation must learn that all people of all nations are children of God and must share the wealth of the world. You can say this is impractical, far away, and never can be accomplished, but this is the work which universalists are appointed to do. Her universalism, though rooted in God, led to an ethics that is very compatible with the Humanist Manifesto, which was written 7 years after her death, to talk about respecting the rights of individuals, sharing wealth. And how does this happen, that a faith so rooted in God comes up with the same ethics as a faith that says there is no God? Well, if God loves all people, as the Universalists believed, then it follows that we shall love all people. On the other hand, if there is no God, then people is all we have, and we need to rely upon one another. Both systems naturally lead for a call for people to help one another despite differences. But if a system of religion says that God plays favorites, that causes war. Why should we care about people that God is going to burn in hell? Think of the religious differences that are preventing an Iraqi constitution. Until Sunni and Shia Muslims can affirm each other's right to exist, how can they have a democracy? How can you affirm the right of infidels to exist? In our own country, those who are most supportive of the war tend to worship a God that sends non-believers to hell, that non-believers should be punished or threatened with punishment until they come around. Olympia Brown's universalism was God's love in action. Humanist universalism puts love into action. It is this action of approaching the world with love and respect for the rights of all individuals that Olympia Brown believed and lived. Universalism is supporting the rights of individuals so that all may live in peace. May we bless and be blessed.